the council convened, and the Byzantines laid out a master plan to take over Anatolia. The next major target was naturally Antioch, but there were many smaller fortresses scattered throughout the harsh environment of the region that needed to be secured. Alexios put the imperial army and navy under the command of his brother-in-law John Ducas, who was tasked with the recovery of the coastal provinces. Seljuk Chaka Bey, who ruled from Smyrna semi-independently from the Sultanate of Rum, still posed a significant threat with his navy, and would prevent any supplies reaching the Crusaders once they made it to Antioch. And while some Latins must have felt abandoned by the emperor, it made no sense for him to join the already giant host, only adding to the logistical issues. Not to mention the risks of Cuman invasions, rebellious generals, or death of the emperor. What if the new ruler wasn't so cooperative with the Crusaders? Once again, the Franks were to be escorted by the trusted general Tatikios, who was extremely loyal to Alexios, and as a Turk himself, he knew exactly what the steppe riders were capable of. Before departing, Alexios gave them plenty of supplies, as well as precious insight, advising them to send envoys to the Fatimid Caliphate and make an alliance with common enemies. And so, 10 days after Nicaea was taken, June 26, 1097, the Crusaders formed a massive column and set off. One of the leaders, Stefan of Blois, wrote back home to his wife, "I say to you, sweetheart, that from Nicaea we will arrive at Jerusalem in 5 weeks, provided that Antioch does not slow us down." Little did he know, the Franks would venture in the mountainous lands in the midst of the summer heat to face an enemy that vanquished tens of thousands of Romans. To reduce the load on the logistics, the coalition army split in two, with the first force moving ahead with Tatikios and Bohemond, the two imperial agents at the front, accompanied by the contingents of Tancred, Robert of Flanders, and Robert of Normandy, while Godfrey, Baldwin, Stefan, Hugh, and Raymond were 3 days' march behind them. It is very difficult to determine the Crusader force, as there were many non-combatants, many among them women and children. The First Army had around 3,000 knights and 10,000 footmen, which included 2,000 Byzantine infantry, accompanied by at least as many camp followers. The second force was at least twice as large, totaling around 4,500 mounted warriors and 20,000 infantry, with just as many non-combatants. Riders were constantly galloping between the two halves, ensuring a steady flow of information about the route they were taking. And while the vast column crawled towards the crucial site of Dorylaeum, the Seljuks observed their every move from the hilltops. The Seljuk Turks were not alone, as Kilij Arslan managed to convince his rival, the Turkic Danishmends, to put their differences aside and combine their armies for a total force between 10 and 15,000 steppe riders. They were equipped with leather armor and piercing swords, but the greatest tool in their arsenal was the recurve bow, with an effective range of 50 to 60 meters. Combined with their expert riding ability and knowledge of the terrain, this was the deadly combination that crushed the Byzantines in Manzikert, back when Romanos also decided to split his army in two halves. It is important to note that unlike many other nomadic peoples, the Seljuk Turks of Anatolia were stripped of a massive advantage due to the nature of the terrain. Despite controlling the region for over a decade, they couldn't raise enough horses to provide each of their riders with half a dozen remounts, meaning that they had to sacrifice in either speed or endurance. In the afternoon of the 30th of June, a few Seljuk scouts were spotted, and the Crusader vanguard made camp and sent a messenger to the Second Army, informing them to be on high alert before continuing their march the next morning. Imagining themselves as a Roman legion, weapons taken up, trumpets sounding, arranged against the enemy in wings, centurions leading cohorts and centuries, standards raised, in an orderly fashion we began to set forth. After crossing a small river, the army entered the junction of two valleys, 45 kilometers from Dorylaeum. The open plain was wide enough for the Seljuk maneuvers, but also allowed them to catch the Crusaders by surprise. They couldn't have picked a better spot for an ambush. As soon as the Seljuk force was seen, Bohemond ordered a camp to be constructed by the infantry, picking a spot close to the river, hoping that the marshy ground would give them protection on one flank. In order to buy them some time, he and Robert of Normandy gathered the entire cavalry force of 3,000 knights and charged at Kilij Arslan. The fighting raged for almost an hour, but the light cavalry overwhelmed the Latin nobility, sending them back towards the makeshift camp, where some dug trenches, while the non-combatants and baggage train were directed towards the center. Hundreds of troops that were between the two Crusader armies poured into the battlefield, completely unaware of the ongoing battle, before they were captured or killed. Bohemond and Robert ordered their entire force to dismount and positioned the heavily armored cavalrymen to hold the vanguard and withstand volley after volley. There were no walls, just a mass of people in chain armor in the summer heat, holding together against these circling nomads who tried to pick them off one at a time, screaming and taunting in the hope they would turn their back and flee. One eyewitness reports, "They encircled us on all sides, engaging at close quarters and throwing darts and spears and firing arrows wondrously far and wide. They howled and shrieked and shouted, making a devilish noise in their high voices, crying and shouting like demons." One particular Frankish knight called Robert of Paris, with a notorious background, was one of the first casualties. Back at Constantinople, he mocked the emperor by sitting on his imperial seat. Instead of punishing him, Alexios invited him for a drink and explained they were allies, advising him to never chase their nomadic common enemy. Overcome by anger, the knight threw himself at the Seljuks after multiple civilians were shot around him. Within moments, his movement was slowed by arrows piercing his armor. Soon he was slashed by a blade in full sight of the rest of the knights, who continued to hold their shields up. Bohemond and Robert were now screaming, ordering their men to hold the line, fully aware that if the lines broke, there would be nowhere to run. At first, women constantly supplied the soldiers with buckets of water from the river, but as the hours dragged on, they also had the role of dragging the dead away from the front. Both duties were essential to the survival of everyone inside the camp, but with each passing moment, hope was fading. People and animals alike were crying out, while priests were praying for salvation, when suddenly Kilij Arslan gave the order to attack the camp from every direction, both on horse and on foot. Brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued, with many casualties, including Tancred's brother William. Charge after charge failed to break the Normans, but then suddenly a detachment appeared from the marsh and entered the camp, killing anyone in their path. A band of knights quickly rushed to close the gap and push them back, but the Christians were at the brink. It was then a group of cavalrymen appeared on the horizon. It had now been 5 hours since the first clash between the two armies, but after receiving word of the attack, Godfrey of Bouillon arrived at noon alongside 50 knights and bravely charged against the Seljuks, who halted their attack on the camp and turned on the reinforcements. Not long after, Raymond and Hugh joined the fight, and while Kilij Arslan still had the numerical advantage, the lack of remounts and length of the engagement meant that his army was extremely low on both energy and ammunition. At this point, Tatikios and Bohemond switched from a defensive stance to an offensive one, and as the Crusader cavalry engaged the steppe horsemen for the Battle of Anatolia, another detachment was seen on top of a hill behind the Seljuk line. Bishop Ademar, who used local guides to outflank the enemy, gave a rousing speech as Provençal troops charged into the enemy camp, plundering the Sultan's tent before setting it all on fire and advancing on the enemy. With enemies on all sides, the Turkic army had no space to execute their masterful maneuvers and had no choice but to flee. The formations held, the reinforcements arrived, and this victory sent ripples through the entire Muslim world. Ibn al-Qalanisi, an Arabic writer, noted, "When news was received of the shameful calamity to the cause of Islam, the anxiety of the people became acute, and their fear and alarm increased." 3,000 nomads perished in the battle, while the Christians lost 4,000 of their own, who were celebrated as martyrs. The plunder of the camp resulted in numerous fine weapons, gold coins, jewels, horses and camels, not to mention much needed grain. Everyone involved played a crucial role, but the man who was celebrated the most was Bohemond of Taranto, who rallied his men to stand their ground and fight. It was his courage and leadership that prevented another massacre. It didn't take long before supernatural elements were infused into the events. Seljuk deserters swore that they had seen 2 horsemen with shimmering weapons and of wondrous appearance riding ahead of our army, menacing the enemy such that they allowed them no opportunity for fighting. Christian chroniclers later wrote that God sent 3 saints, George, Demetrius and Theodore, traditionally connected with the Orthodox Church, to save the Crusaders from doom. When the army broke camp on July 4th, they observed that the road was littered with dead horses and Seljuks, which they took as evidence of the saints charging after the routed enemy. The further the army moved away from Constantinople, the more biblical elements were infused into their beliefs and actions, the boundaries between both worlds slowly evaporating.